Fill to capacity. Crazy good stories and timely topics. Podcast for people too stubborn to quit and too creative not to make a difference. Inspiring, irreverent, and informative. Stay tuned. Hi, I'm Pat Benincasa, and welcome to Fill to Capacity. Today's episode, Medical Advocate, a journeyed struggle of a resilient soul. My guest is Helen Salfi Gorday. She has been a long-term medical caregiver with quite a story to share. Welcome, Helen. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you. Thank you, Pat. Thank you for having me.
Well, I want to give our listeners a brief bio. Helen's parents are Jimmy and Teresa Salfi, and with her brother Paul, they lived in Sudbury, Ontario. Helen, who was a teacher, married Jim Gorday, who also a teacher, and they moved to St. Catharines, Ontario, and had two daughters, Chrissy and Jeannie. And it's also where Paul lived with his wife Lillian and their kids. So listeners, I just want to give you a little bit of a roadmap as to who's who. And by the way, Helen is my cousin. So I know this story, but not to the degree that Helen is about to share. And for those of you who are caring and advocating for a loved one, this journey may sound familiar. So let's jump in. Helen, you did back-to-back medical care, first with your mom, Teresa, and then with your husband, Jim. Let's start with your mom. Will you briefly tell us what kind of person was she?
My mom was a very dynamic, independent woman. She had a lot of interests. She was adept at sewing, knitting. She had a command of the English language, even though she came from Italy at a very young age. She helped people from Italy who came and needed help. She was just very confident and was the main giver in the family. She took in a cousin of my dad's who was in the hospital with appendectomy, and she cared for him. She was a lover of opera and the arts.
I can say as a witness, when your mom walked into a room, there was just this energy of laughter and light and love. So that's a pretty good description, Helen. Thank you. In January of 1972, she got the flu that turned out to be viral encephalitis. And encephalitis is an inflammation of the brain, and it's potentially life-threatening and may lead to permanent brain damage or death. Now, she spent several weeks in hospital in Toronto, and you and your brother Paul went back and forth from St. Catharines by bus, and that's about an hour and a half to and from. Will you tell us about those trips?
Well, it was very stressful. She got the viral encephalitis in Sudbury, and it took a few weeks before she was transferred to the Toronto hospital because of the protocol that ensued between the Sudbury doctor and that of Toronto. The Toronto doctor was a family friend, a well-known neurologist who was happy to care for my mom. And during this period that she was in Toronto, she did suffer some damage to her head. Her short-term memory was very poor. Every time she went to the washroom, she would come back into the room and be surprised that we were there. And this could happen maybe 5, 6, 7 times during the visit.
Wow.
And during this time that she was so sick, she has told us often that she passed on and she saw the tunnel, but she didn't see the light, but she saw her grandmother. And she felt like she was in the old country, the street that she was on when she would come home from school. When she came home from the hospital, she and my dad stayed with Jim and I for about a year. And at the beginning, she felt that Paul was her brother and I was her sister. And it took her a while to reach to the present situation that we were her children.
So let me stop you there. So she moved in with you at that time. But I also want to bring up the fact that during that time, Paul was in a catastrophic car accident, which took him many months to recover. And he did recover eventually. So basically, that happens. You're taking care of your mom. She's moved in with you. At that point, was she with you for about a year?
Yes, she was.
And then your dad and mom moved out of the house into the neighborhood where your dad took care of her for 9 years until his death in 1982. In those years, Helen, can you give us a bit of an idea what that was like?
Well, I was there basically every day. My dad had to do a complete role reversal because he, being a European husband, my mother did everything. So he had to learn to guide her with cooking and take on the responsibility doing the banking and so on.
Wait,
And
Helen, before you go any further, he was an Italian husband.
exactly,
Okay.
exactly.
Yeah, we have to say that, folks, because we understand what that means. Okay,
Yes,
so he's helping her with the cooking. He's helping her do everything, right?
yes.
Okay, but
And
go ahead.
I was going to say, I was there basically every day. I would have them for supper. And my mother had difficulty with her teeth, with chewing. So she couldn't handle roast beef. And if I was having roast beef, I would say, if you have any chicken, bring some chicken. And she would say, oh, they invite you for supper and you even have to bring your own meat. She initially was very sad, but she was put on a happy pill, I'm going to say, which made her happy. She was very docile. She never gave my dad a hard time, especially only one time that I can recall that I don't know where my dad might have been downstairs, but she picked up the phone and she asked for the police,
Oh, no.
the police or the fire department. And she said, get me out of here. They wanted to know what was going on. And my dad picked up the phone because he heard her and he said, no, no, she's okay. She's okay. My dad had an Italian accent, very strong, never got rid of it.
All right, so after your dad passed and she moved in with you, you realized that she really needed constant supervision, 24/7 care, and she went to a long-term care facility. And of course, you're constantly there. So, Helen, your mom's illness started in 1972 until her death in 1999. That was 27 years. My question is, how did you balance your family needs with taking care of your mom during those years?
I honestly never really thought about it. My mother was priority, my daughters were priority, and you just automatically go on speed.
Okay.
Just do it.
Okay. You said something to me that was, well, let me quote you. Quote, what I learned through my mother's illness was you cannot think of the person the way they were because it would destroy you when you saw how they had become.
Right. That's right. And it would destroy you because there was such a difference in personality. My mother was no longer my mother. From the time she got sick,
Yeah.
she was no longer my mother. Bodily, yes, but emotionally, spiritually, no.
And she was what? How old?
57 when she got this viral encephalitis. The doctor said that is extremely rare and it happens to children. And here it was, she got it.
Okay, so 6 months before your mom passed, your husband, Jim, had severe, debilitating headaches and started to go blind. Now starts yet another medical care journey. You saw neurologists. He had double vision. They said migraines, and it turned out to be papilledema, which is a condition where pressure in the brain causes swelling on part of the optic nerve. Jim then has leg pain, and it's deep vein thrombosis. He's on blood thinners. Oh my gosh, he's doing well with those thinners. He's starting to do stuff around the house, building decks, doing sports. You must have felt relief seeing him become active.
Very much so. He was Jim, the Jim I knew. He had the energy. He was a doer. He was umpiring. He was playing ball again. He built our daughter's deck. We had a trip to Sudbury for one of the family weddings. We took a golfing trip with some friends in Myrtle Beach. It was wonderful.
Well, that brings me to the next part. The doctors take him off the blood thinners, and his vision gets worse, and he has clots pushing on his optic nerve. And then he goes back to the hospital in Toronto and gets a lumbar shunt. A shunt is a hollow tube designed to redirect bodily fluids from one part of the body to another. So he's in the hospital and he has an episode where he's screaming and yelling and has to be restrained. The doctors don't know why this is happening. Again, more tests. Wow. That in itself had to be very frustrating.
He was having some brownouts after they gave him an initial shunt, not a shunt, but a lumbar puncture. And therefore, they put the shunt in as an emergency surgery.
Okay.
And initially, 7:30 in the morning, the following morning, Jeannie and Christine were there, and they said he was wonderful. He was good. He was lying flat in the bed. I got there at 9 because I had spent the evening at a friend's place in Toronto. I got there. He was like a wild man, yelling, screaming, thrashing. I thought, who is this man? And he was being restrained. They eventually took him to the ICU. From there, he ended up in a coma. He was on life support with the respirator for 9 days. They really did not know what was going on. They told me that his condition was very rare. And I asked what made it so rare. And they said, because usually when you get clots in your brain, it's in the arteries, and his were in the venous system. So they really didn't know why, what was causing the whole situation. And what was really scary was a time in the hospital when the neurosurgeon was telling me what the prognosis would be. And it was in the same room where we heard this, a different type, but still related to the brain, a prognosis for my mom 25 years later. I thought, this can't be happening again. But it did.
It sure seemed that way. Now, at this hospital stay, he was there for about 3.5 months.
Right.
Okay. And you would take the bus to and from St. Catharines again. And sometimes Chrissy and Jeannie would visit their dad, and your brother Paul and his wife Lillian and friends would sometimes sit with you on the bus, join you. What was it like to have this support?
The support was unbelievable, because when you went, you had no idea what the condition he would be in. And most of the time he was sleeping. He had headaches. One neurosurgeon was conferring with another. They really didn't know what was happening. They eventually decided to reverse the shunt, just turn it off, leave it in the body in the off position. But the support was phenomenal.
It was good that you had that. Now,
absolutely.
You mentioned earlier, Jim is not progressing the way the doctors want. He has a few grand mal seizures, and now he has a tumor in his parathyroid, which is not cancerous, but it's another surgery. When you get back home, he has temporal lobe seizures, which affects that part of the brain which processes emotions and short-term memory. Now, again, he starts to get stronger, and you drive him to physio and occupational therapy. And in this time, Jim is blind. Now, you took him to band concerts, events, and visiting with friends. Did you feel responsible for his happiness?
Absolutely. I was his caregiver, his entertainment, his happiness. I tried my best. I tried to keep him occupied so that he would feel useful because he was a man who was used to doing everything. I had to give him jobs, and he was very grateful. Initially, when he came from the hospital, he was so happy to be home and he wanted to do.
All right. So Jim was with you in the house for 11 years, and you said, quote, I had complete burnout. Will you talk about that?
I did. By the time the initial years, as I said, were good because he was so happy to be home. But then gradually, and even during this time, like we would go to Sudbury to see his mom, his sister, and there was a medical man. I'm not going to say he was a doctor, but he was into isodynamics, where he believed that the body heals itself.
Okay.
And he had a technique. So I would take Jim, and you had to pay out of pocket. And he would have Jim lie in his tummy. He would do some manipulation with his heels and a few tappings, and kind of gave Jim the impression that these appointments would lead to a cure of his blindness. And Jim believed this. I was happy to pay this money just to keep him in a good mood mentally.
Yep.
Because he needed that. And this went on for a number of years. Gradually, I think he gave up, starting to give up hope.
All right.
And I think that's when the depression started.
Let me stop you there because you lost your brother Paul to cancer, and he died only 3 months after his diagnosis. Now, Jim and Paul were very, very close. So this had to be really a tough time for you both. And was that a turning point for him becoming depressed?
Actually, Paul died 2003. And his other very good friend, the three of them were always together. It was the friend from childhood, died in 2010. And that was like the icing on the cake. He became extremely depressed.
Okay. I want to say here there's two parts to Jim's medical story. One, the decline of his physical health, including blindness. But the second was the dramatic decline in his mental health. Now he is rageful, jealous, paranoid, and severely depressed. Jim is a different man with a totally different personality. Now, when you care for someone with long-term illness, this impacts the whole family. He's taking it out on you and Chrissy and Jeannie. Helen, how did you all cope during this time?
I really don't know how we coped. We just supported each other. We tried to emphasize to each other that's not Jim. That's not the dad we know. But it still was very hurtful.
Yeah.
Even though you recognize the situation, it still hurts to a degree that you can't imagine.
Yeah.
There were a lot of tears, a lot of sadness. We couldn't help it.
Yeah.
We loved him. We wanted to help him. And we understood how he was angry. He couldn't understand. And he could not accept. Acceptance is very difficult.
All right. So I want to jump in here and say by this point, your doctors tell you that you cannot go on like this. Your blood pressure is through the roof and that he needs to go to a retirement home. And Jim is extremely angry at you and the girls, and he keeps insisting that he isn't any trouble. He can do everything on his own. He does not see your burnout. Helen, how were you able to steady yourself?
I honestly don't know. I had a lot of support from my daughters. When I would talk about it to my doctor, who was different than Jim's doctor, he said, do you want to be in that position again? He really told me I should not take him back because I was a mess at that time.
So he's in the retirement home and he's really mad. He takes your name off his pension and bank accounts, even though you have been doing all of the financial stuff. At one point, he threatened to take a taxi in the middle of the night to kick down your door. You were so scared that at night you put a little marble table in front of the door and kept a suitcase in your car. Helen, what was going through your mind?
Well, when he would threaten to come home, break down the door, he wanted to live in the basement. He could do everything by himself. I mean, it was frightening. It was absolutely frightening. And he had a very good friend who lived up the hill from the retirement home, who was very supportive, took him to the gym twice a week. And he had this friend take him home. He took some clothes with him, and like the idea, Jim still believed he could live in the basement. Well, I certainly wouldn't put him in the basement. I didn't know what the result would be. And I said, you should go back because you need your pills. But when he would get really angry with me, he would threaten to stop eating, not taking his pills anymore. He wanted his passport so he could go to China. He was going to go in a lake how many miles away. He was
So,
desperate and he was angry and he wanted to frighten me. It was difficult.
yeah. So this is happening in September 2010. And then in October, you tested for breast cancer. And in July, you had a mastectomy and started chemo. Now, Jim is still acting out and he wasn't nice to you even during the chemo. How did you not fall apart under the strain of caring for him and your physical recovery?
I think in one way, so difficult at the time, I did not have that much time to think about myself and my position
Okay.
because I'm the biggest coward as far as medical things. And he was such a distraction. And he was trying to talk his social workers into convincing me that he should be able to come home at that time for a trial. And I thought, how can I do this? And I spent a lot of time praying.
Yep.
I prayed to the Holy Spirit for guidance and strength.
Now, he has hallucinations, confusion. He's continuing with the temporal lobe seizure. And now the doctors are telling you he doesn't need retirement home care. He needs long-term care. But Jim, as you said, keeps saying, I can move into the basement. You're getting chemo, but yet you found him a long-term care place and he liked it. And at first, he seemed calm and maybe more accepting of what happened to him. But then he would have these mood swings, get angry, impatient. And he even, during that time, encouraged you to visit a cousin in Michigan, and you did. But when you got back, he was pouty, angry, and told you to leave his laundry at the door and go. Helen, how did you cope with not knowing which Jim he was going to be?
It was very difficult. Now, he went through all that while he was still in the retirement home
Okay.
during that period. And then when I was having the other social workers talk to him, because at that time, his mood would change. Like one minute he would be good. And the next minute, like one instance, there was one evening I took him to the band concert. Even while he was in the home, I would try and do things for him and with him to keep him happy. And he said he was going to the gym the next day. His hearing aid batteries had gone. And I said, well, I'll bring you ones on Saturday. Well, as it turned out, his friend couldn't take him Friday. So he became so angry, he was going to go to the drugstore and get his own batteries. He had a general idea where it was, but he can't see. So one woman found him in the middle of a busy road, the highway, and figured he was from this retirement home. And I had been going for help with the Cancer Association at the time. And when I got home, this is the message I received. So I mean, he was good one day and not the next.
Yep.
And sometimes when I would take him home, he'd want to do things. I'd have him do little jobs. He would be happy. And from the time he went in, I did not keep him overnight. I would take him for visits, but I was afraid to keep him overnight in case he would never go back.
That
And
makes
he was a
sense.
big man,
Yes, he
a
was.
big man. He
So
was over 200 pounds, over 6 feet.
so by 2018, he started to have lesions on his midriff. He went to the hospital to have them removed, but someone noticed that there were wires in the wound. You knew when you saw them that it was his shunt trying to come out of his body, and you instructed the nurse, do nothing until the doctor sees him. Do nothing. You brought the shunt files where, when that surgery happened, the doctor, but when you got back to the hospital, the wires had been cut, and you demanded to see the doctor, and the doctor told you that no one had told him that they had done that. Now, Jim gets cellulitis immediately after. They do tests, more tests. His blood sugar goes crazy. He has problems with kidneys because of all the antibiotics, and they lose his upper dentures. You said of that time, it was a horror story. Helen, how did you not explode?
I did explode because of the fact that I had specifically said I didn't want anything done to the shunt. But when the doctor talked to me, he said the shunt order was done by the plastic surgeon who did the surgery, who again really didn't know what it was that he was removing. But the doctor told me that we had a bigger issue. Jim had been dealing at this time with prostate cancer, and he had been receiving injections. And in the last 6 months, his numbers went sky high, and the cancer had taken over and it started to metastasize. So they knew that that was bad. And he deteriorated while he was in the hospital. Up to the time he had the lesions removed, he was fine. He had showed that he had accepted things when he was in the long-term care, and he was good. But that just caused one episode after another. You had to be constantly advocating because all of a sudden he was going to be coming home. First, our daughters and myself, seeing how he was, wanted him just to be palliative and to be comfortable. But they were talking about radiation and then they didn't talk about it. And I thought, well, I guess they forgot about it. And then all of a sudden they were sending him back to the long-term care because they only hold your bed for X number of weeks.
Oh,
And then whether you're paying or not, they'll just allot it to somebody else.
okay.
So I asked this young nurse, she was a student, if he had had this radiation, because from one day to the next, all of a sudden he had it. No one's told me. And she went to the nurse's station, came back. She said yes. And I thought, So I said, could you go back and ask again? And she came back, gave me the same answer. And then a third time I said, blame it on me, but please go back and ask them to check again. So then she came back and she said, no, she said, they haven't even got a date yet. So initially they say he's had it. And in essence, he didn't even have a date yet.
Oh, no. Okay. So
So
then,
they sent him back to the home.
oh,
And then after a while, they said that he should have this radiation because at this point, he's in extreme pain. They use a lift to move him from the bed to the chair. He can hardly keep his head up. And then when they tell you that it's going to alleviate 60% of the pain, you think, well, maybe you should have him do it. But it was a very traumatic experience. I couldn't get him in the car. The service has to be notified 2 or 3 days in advance. And so it was difficult. It was stressful. Everything was stressful. But we managed to have that appointment. And he was sick to his stomach on the way home because the roads were under construction. It was difficult for him.
yep, yep.
And then it was just like I should have realized that the end was near when we brought him his favorite food and it took him 3 days to eat it.
And then Jim passed on June 29, 2019.
Yes.
So you told me that you did vent during the worst of times, and you said, quote, I would have to vent, but I can honestly say, I never really felt sorry for myself. Helen, I don't know how you did it. I would have been a pity party mess that would have destroyed me, but not you.
I don't know. I really never went through the stage of poor me. Why did this happen to me? I just kind of accepted that I had breast cancer. I had to have a mastectomy. I had the chemo. Chemo was very difficult. I just went on. I prayed and I went on.
Okay.
And I had a lot of support from my friends. I did.
So, in your adult life, you spent over 30 years taking care of your mother and then your husband while raising your daughters. You lost a brother to cancer. Then you had a mastectomy and chemo while still caring for Jim. When you look at all those years, what do you think got you through?
I think my faith did. My faith did. When I would visit Jim at the hospital in Toronto, they had the St. Mike's Cathedral was right by. If I was there on a Sunday, I would go to mass or I would make a little visit in the chapel, and I would just ask God to help me. I couldn't do it all.
Yeah. So you described Jim as a good man. You had a good marriage. He was a teacher, athletic, a handyman. He enjoyed helping people. And then, quote, and then all that is taken from him all at once. He lost everything. That's pretty hard, end quote. Helen, your compassion is beyond words.
Well, I knew the type of man he was. I knew how much he tried when he came out of the hospital. He started trying to mow his own lawn with two white lawn chairs as a guide. Younger daughter, Christine, was getting married. He wanted to, this was maybe a year or two after he was out. You always want to do something to the house, decorate it or something. And we ended up ripping out the rug in the living room, and he finished the hardwood floors that were already there, the original. And then we needed new quarter round. And so I would have to go downstairs and guide him with his big table saw so he could make the right cut with the quarter round. And he was happy to do that.
Hey, I got to stop you. So your blind husband and you are cutting quarter round with a power saw.
Yes, and I never knew how to do anything. But I made sure, but Patty, another thing that happened to him during all this, he started to wash the floors with the mop, and he could make out black on white, and that was like our tiles in the kitchen. I didn't care if he missed part of it because I knew eventually it would get clean. And if I had to go out and get groceries or do an errand, I would have him set up with his story on tape that was supplied by CNIB, and he'd have his coffee, and I would let him stay. I said, stay there and listen to your tape. But I think a lot of times, as soon as I left, he went downstairs to explore his tools.
Oh, no.
And one time he went down to get some water to wash the floor, got halfway up the stairs, fell backwards and landed on the concrete, managed to crawl up to the bed. When I came in, he said, Helen, come quick. And he was in his underwear because he had been soaking from the fall backwards. I called 911. They said, don't give him anything. I said, I already gave him painkillers. But then he was taken to the hospital. He was in the hospital then again. He was in the hospital about 3 times for sure, easy, during this period.
During that period, overall, you had numerous
Yes.
hospital visits, physio, occupational visits, appointments, follow-ups. So, Helen, you are so engaged with life, intellectually curious, on top of current events. You garden, you read voraciously. I know that when we talk on the phone, you're always telling me about a new book you've read. Most importantly, you have this passion and joy for life. Looking back on all that's happened, it seems that you never lost your passion and joy for life.
I didn't. I felt, looking back, I think, oh, no wonder I feel tired.
Yeah.
I lost a lot of weight during his last year or two because I rarely ate lunch. I would go in the morning, I would be there so that he would eat and engage and have the conversation at the table with the people he was with. Yeah, I never put the weight back on, but I just kept up with the friendships. And during the time that he was sick, and even in the home, I would try and have him come to the house and have people over because he couldn't engage anymore, but
Okay.
he could sit and know that the other people were there because he wanted to visit them, and that gave him joy.
Okay. So, what advice would you give to someone going through the things that you went through?
Well, I would say you have to keep your faith, keep your friends close, and don't be afraid to tell them what's in your heart. Don't be afraid to cry.
Mhm.
I went to counseling when I was going through my cancer, and the counseling was very good. They were support groups, and I went 3 times because the facilitator was so good. But most of the time, I was not talking about my cancer. I was talking about Jim. And she was in her profession, she was able to deal with that. The people at the retirement home, one of the nurses told me I should be going to Al Anon. And eventually I did go and I did get some support then. You do need support. You can't do it all by yourself. Don't be afraid to reach out.
Well, that's
That's
great
what I
advice.
would say.
So, I think your daughter Jeannie sums up, and I know Chrissy agrees with this quote, her story is one of compassion and courage and faith. I am amazed at how strong she is. That's from your two daughters.
See, and I don't really think of myself as strong. I don't think of myself as doing anything remarkable. I
Hel-
just felt I did what I had to do. I
Helen,
always felt that I was like in the background.
you know, you say that, and I know you mean it from your heart, but I have to ask you, what the hell are you made of? I mean, that's what I'd like to know. And I think to myself quite selfishly, wow, we share the same DNA? Lucky me. And lucky all of us who know and love you, and those hearing your story for the first time. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Pat.